Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Jesse, and I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants, the digital education partner of this amazing Nature Ideas series. For those of you who are joining us again, welcome back. For those of you who are new to this is Nature Ideas, an incredible series from the Museum of Nature in Ottawa, one of my very favorite places to visit in the entire country, that is all about Canada's relationship with nature and its integral part in our future. So this specific series has been sponsored by the amazing team at the U.S. Embassy, specifically the U.S. Mission to Canada. So a huge thank you to them for making this possible as we continue to sort of bridge gaps between countries and highlight these really integral and exciting stories of nature in Canada and around the world. If you want to see our past programs in the Nature Ideas series, head to our YouTube channel, head to the Museum of Nature Ideas section, and you can see all those recordings there. Some really, really special stuff we've had over the last few months. Now, today we are diving with a very, very special topic in honor of Oceans Week. Now, Oceans Day, World Oceans Day, is June 8th, for those who don't know, just coming up tomorrow. And Oceans Day began as this sort of central hub of amazing events and stories and ideas around the world. And it's metamorphosed, it's grown, it's gone crazy into this incredible week of events that really does happen across on a global scale, whether it's shoreline cleanups, public talks, ways of engaging people with the importance of our oceans to humanity and to life on Earth. Now, when I think of oceans, when I was a boy thinking of oceans, I always thought of the tropical oceans, or oceans that had tropical places, the Great Barrier Reef. I thought of the Maldives being affected by climate change, maybe the Atlantic here on the east coast of Canada. I never really cast my gaze upwards to the Arctic. And so that's what we are going to do today on a really, really special program called Arctic Perspectives, Oceans of Change. So today, if any of you signed up on the Nature Ideas site, you will see that we do not have a face there that we were expecting to have for today's program. Kirstin Holsman, unfortunately, was ill today, so we wish her a very speedy recovery. She was set to join us from NOAA today, but you can check out her work online, her bio on the Nature Ideas site, and she's really been doing some pretty incredible work over the last many, many years on the topics that we're going to address today. So instead, our agenda is a little bit different. Together, we're going to, I'm going to press the wrong button and screw up the whole thing. I'm a professional broadcaster, and this happens even to me. So our agenda, we're going to dive into a little bit of an introduction in a minute by Dr. Amanda Savoie. She is joining us from the Canadian Museum of Nature, where she is a botanical researcher and a director for the museum's Center for Arctic Exploration and Study. So we're going to turn over to her to tell us a little bit about the museum's work to elucidate this wide and wonderful world of Arctic research and exploration. And then we're going to dive in with our big principal talk today from Dr. Jackie Dawson. But without further ado, Dr. Savoie, thank you so much for joining us, and tell us a little bit more about the museum and their amazing work.
Thank you so much, Jesse. That was an amazing intro. So good evening, everyone. Bonsoir and bienvenue. So like Jesse said, my name is Dr. Amanda Savoie. I'm a research scientist at the Canadian Museum of Nature, and I'm a phycologist, which means that I study seaweed. So basically the ocean is super near and dear to my heart, and I'm really excited about this talk. I'm also the director of the Museum Center for Arctic Knowledge and Exploration. C'est avec plaisir que nous vous accueillons ce soir pour cette conférence virtuelle qui fait partie de notre série Idées Nature. So this is the third of our Arctic Perspectives presentations for Nature Ideas. Like Jesse said, this is our series exploring Canada's relationship with nature, its integral role in our future, and our collaborations with the United States. So we are very grateful for the support of the U.S. Mission to Canada Public Affairs Grant Program. And we're going to highlight collaboration in the Arctic between Canada and the United States. As well, even though today we're meeting on a virtual platform, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from my home on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. It's a privilege to live and work on this land. From coast to coast to coast, I acknowledge the ancestral territory of Inuit, Métis, and First Nations peoples. And today we're focusing on all things Arctic, and it's important to note that the Canadian Arctic, also Inuit Nunavut, is the homeland of the Inuit in Canada. And this Arctic region is also extremely sensitive to the impacts of climate change and is unfortunately warming at a rate of at least 3 times faster than the rest of the planet. And I know for some people it may seem remote, but we also know that changes in the Arctic have global impacts. So this understanding of Arctic biodiversity, of Arctic impacts, of environmental change, both in the past and the present, is really essential to understand and bring about a sustainable natural future for our planet. So at the Canadian Museum of Nature, we have scientists who visit the Arctic. They study and document the region's natural history and geological record. And then we keep that evidence in our collections, the national collections at our museum, where we curate some of the world's best collections of Arctic plants, animals, fishes, fossils, minerals, and more, including seaweeds and algae, which are my favorite. And these records, both historical and recent, are a critical scientific baseline. They inform future studies of biodiversity and the impacts of climate change. The Center for Arctic Knowledge and Exploration also supports Arctic research programs at the museum and provides a forum for sharing ideas, training future scientists, and exchanging information about the Arctic. One example being the Nature Ideas program this evening. And thank you, Jesse. Back to you. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy Jackie's talk.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Amanda. What I'm going to do is put in the YouTube chat the entire link to the Center for Arctic Knowledge and Exploration. Some really incredible stuff there if you want to dive into the research, the education work that the museum's been doing, again, to bring the Arctic to people like you. I know we've got a wide audience today, 170 folks registered from around the world, so thank you so much. And do let us know where you're joining from in the chat. We'd love to hear from you, and that'll also be your one-stop shop and place to share questions at the end of our talks today. Now, we are about to dive in with our speaker extraordinaire, Dr. Jackie Dawson. And I must say, when we get these bios of speakers, it's always fun to see the accomplishments and litany of amazing things that people have done. And even by that standard, in my role as getting to share scientists and explorers with the public, Jackie really stands out. She is a fellow of basically everything. She is a professor at the University of Ottawa, and she is one of the leading voices in the world of Arctic communities, the work that's being done up there, the changes that are happening up there. Her bio lists her as an expert in Arctic shipping, Arctic tourism, and Arctic oceans governance. Now, these are things that are so exciting that I honestly, you see people like this in the news sometimes. So it's so nice to have her here today. And in the last 15 minutes before we dove into the program, I will say as well that she is just a sheer delight. So I'm excited to turn it over to Dr. Dawson to tell us a little bit about her amazing work, being this advocate and voice for the Arctic and how it's changing. And without further ado, Dr. Dawson, thank you so much for joining us, and take us away.
Excellent. Thank you, Jesse. Thank you for that very enthusiastic introduction. And also thank you, Dr. Savoie. Nice to see you. As Jesse said, I'm a professor at the University of Ottawa, and I'm also scientific director of ArcticNet, which is a network centers of excellence in Canada focused on Arctic science. And like Amanda, I'm also joining you from Ottawa, the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. So I'm grateful to be joining you from here. But I am going to talk about the Arctic, which has 4 settled Inuit land claim areas, as well as many Métis and First Nations people. So we'll dig right in. This is what I'm going to talk to you about today. The stripes, which I'm sure you're thinking, now what is that? So I'll tell you in a minute. I'm going to talk about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, AR6, which stands for the 6th Assessment Report. So I was Kirstin as well, who couldn't join tonight, and myself are one of the authors on that report that's just recently come out. So I'll talk a bit about that. And the whole presentation is informed by some of those findings. So you're getting the latest and the greatest of the facts and figures that are coming out of the scientific community right now. But I'm really going to focus on climate change and the Arctic Ocean and tell you a little bit about what's going on there. As Jesse alluded, we're always talking about the East and the West and the Great Lakes, especially in Canada and the US, but we often forget about the Arctic part of the ocean. So we're going to dive in there. And one of the most important things, ecosystems in the Arctic Ocean is sea ice. So I'm going to talk about sea ice change and what that means in terms of risks and opportunities moving into the future. And I can't help myself. I'll make a few concluding remarks and give you some thoughts and opinions. So just a little bit about myself. I love the Arctic. I fell in love with the Arctic a very, very long time ago, reading books about Arctic exploration. But what really draws me to the Arctic are the people. And so I do a lot of work combining what we call, Western science, although I don't love that term, but science as we might learn about it in our high school and university classes, combining it with Indigenous knowledge and local knowledge, because that is where you find the best answers to any of the major problems that we are being faced with. So these are just some of the pictures of the fieldwork that I've been lucky enough to do. That picture in the middle is actually on Beachy Island, which I'm going to talk a little bit about later, because I'm going to bring you back around to the Franklin expedition, and those grave sites there are from the Franklin expedition, which of course is we've now found the original vessels, the Erebus and the Terror. So really interesting history. So the stripes. So often I'll throw this up in a class and I'll say to my students, what do you think this is? And lately they've been all telling me, well, it's the intro to Netflix, because I guess it looks like that, but that is not what this is. Someone else the other day told me it was the new design on an IKEA pillow, but this also is not what that is. This is actually temperature change over time. So each line here is a year of temperature from left to right. We're going from 1850 to 2019, and the blue is cold, the red is hot. So you can see this is the global average temperature change over time. So we are definitely heading into a warming period, and I'll be hammering home that point over and over. These stripes are Australia. So you can create stripes for really anywhere. So these are the warming stripes for Australia. So a little bit warmer in the more recent years in Australia, not surprising with all the fires that we're seeing, etc. These are the warming stripes in Africa, even warmer. We hear about droughts all the time in Africa. So that's a very acute region. Now, woo! This is the Arctic Ocean. And I just want to draw your attention to that right-hand stripe. That is very stark and very real. So we often forget about the Arctic, but we cannot do that because it is warming at 2 to 3, often 3 times the rate of the global average. And it is one of the hot spots for climate change. So in order to keep this in mind throughout the presentation, I've just put it on the left-hand side for you the whole way through. So we are seeing significant warming, especially in the Arctic Ocean historically. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is an UN organization that brings scientists together from all over the world to write an assessment on the latest understandings, facts, figures on climate change. And so there are 3 different working groups. The first working group really focuses on the causes and drivers of climate change. The second working group, which is the working group I was on, talks about impacts and adaptation. And the third working group talks about mitigation. So I'm gonna focus a little more in the center here today on what's actually gonna happen, what has happened, and maybe a little bit about what we can do about it. These are the authors that were on the Polar Regions chapter with me, a lovely group of people from Germany, Finland, Australia, Canada, the United States, and it was just a pleasure working with this group for the past about 18 months together. We met in different places around the world to bring our chapter together, but in the whole report, there were about 270 scientists from all over the world. It was really inspiring meeting people from different countries. 41% were women, 59% men, 43% were from developing countries, and 57% were from developed countries, and representing 67 different countries around the world. So very, it's considered the creme of the crop, the report to go to for global decision making. And this is one of the sentences that kind of sums up the whole thing at a high level. And this is written in there, and it says, the science is clear. Any further delay in concerted global action will miss a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. And in the report, we offer some solutions for that, to creating a livable world. And I'm going to show you some things that will make this quote really pop in a second. So history. My son wrote a history exam today at school, so this is good. It was good timing to throw this history slide together. So historically, temperature is variable. It changes over time. It's not unusual to have higher and lower temperature, but in the last the time of human civilization in the Holocene period, we have had a very stable climate. That has enabled us to live in the way that we live. It hasn't been quite this stable in the past. And what we're seeing is, what we're worried about is coming out of this stable climate period from the Holocene into what we're calling the Anthropocene, where we see a rapid increase in temperature at the rate and scale that we have never seen before. So interestingly, we also historically have had some variability in CO2 or carbon dioxide levels over time. And for 400,000 years prior to the Industrial Revolution, the peak atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide have been below 300 parts per million. But since then, global CO2 concentrations have climbed to over 400 parts per million. So this is concerning. Carbon dioxide is our main greenhouse gas. And so if we look at, this is a graph at temperature change over time. And now the blue line here, this explains temperature variability if we do not consider human release of greenhouse gases. So this includes all natural variation, sunspots, volcanic activity, solar flares, etc. But when, as scientists, we overlay the release of greenhouse gases from human activities, these lines now almost mirror each other. So we are absolutely certain that climate change is human-induced, absolutely certain. And greenhouse gases, especially carbon dioxide, are the culprit. Not all greenhouse gases are equal, but we usually only talk about carbon dioxide. It is the most prominent of the greenhouse gases, and it lasts for a very long time in the atmosphere, actually about 300 to 1,000 years. So any release of carbon dioxide we make now, or greenhouse gases, are going to stay with us for a very long time. So that's why we have to act now. We cannot wait. Methane is about 84 carbon dioxide. So one methane is equal to about 84 units of carbon dioxide, and nitrous oxide is even more potent. But these greenhouse gases dissipate in the atmosphere a little more quickly than carbon dioxide. So there's your 101 greenhouse gas information. So what's happening in the Arctic? So these are some figures showing you overall temperature change, land surface temperature and sea surface temperature. And in the Arctic, we're seeing warming at greater rates than anywhere. So we call this Arctic amplification. So currently across the globe, we have observed that we are sitting at about 1.1 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial sort of average. And you may know that the Paris Agreement that we've all agreed to as different countries from around the world means or commits us to limiting warming to between 1.5 and 2 degrees. But the problem is in the Arctic, we're warming at 2 to 3 times the rate of the average. So we're already at 3 degrees above warming in the Arctic. So if we get to 2 degrees globally or 3 degrees globally, we'll be at 4 and 6 degrees above that average in the Arctic, which will cause major repercussions. And as Dr. Savoie said at the beginning, what happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic. The Arctic actually has a regulating role, and it regulates climate globally. So this is not a problem just for the Arctic and what you might consider a small population in the Arctic. It is a problem for the entire world. So one thing we're seeing is a major increase, 20-fold increase, in fact, in marine heat waves. And so at 1.5 degree warming, so in the not too distant future, we think we're going to have marine heat waves once every 10 to 100 years. And at 3 degrees, we might have them once every 1 to 10 years. And these are they can be very catastrophic events for the ecosystems, the marine ecosystems where these are occurring. So sea ice, I promised I was going to talk about sea ice. This is my favorite thing, sea ice and shipping. So sea ice is declining naturally, no surprise. With temperature increases, we see a reduction in sea ice. So with that Arctic amplification that I talked about, we're seeing an extension of the sea ice melt season by 11 days every decade. and a later freeze onset by 8 days per decade. So that means every decade, the open water season is 19 days longer. So, of course, you might think that's exciting for shipping or tourism or other activities. So I am going to get into that in a minute. One really important thing, especially for Canada, but also for the US, Canada, and Greenland, because we need to work together, is the last ice area. So because of reductions in sea ice, we've been able to model the change in ice mobility, not me specifically, but my colleagues. And it is likely that this area here, you can see in white in the map, is going to be the last area where we have sea ice. When it disappears, it'll disappear. And this is multi-year ice. So this is ice that never melts. And so Arctic sea ice actually keeps the polar regions cool, helps to moderate global climate, as I mentioned. And sea ice is bright. It has a bright surface. So 80% of the sunlight that strikes sea ice is reflected back into space. But as sea ice melts and into the summertime, it exposes more of the dark ocean surface. Instead of reflecting 80% of the sunlight, the ocean will absorb 90% of the sunlight. The ocean heats up, the Arctic temperature rises further. So this is that amplification, that albedo effect that we were talking about. And we have a real responsibility because that last ice area is sitting right in the north of Canada. So this is going to have major implications for the entire system. I love this figure. This is from an IPCC report, special report that came out in 2019. And it just shows the whole kind of Arctic system, which of course is a lot more than the environment. It's the environment mixed with people living there, mixed with industry, like anywhere. And in particular, Inuit who have settled land claims in the region. So lots of interactions that are going to happen as the sea ice is reduced. It's going to have these cascading impacts on every single one of the sectors that you see in the picture there. So a couple small examples. It's going to have maybe a risk and an opportunity for crustaceans. So this is snow crab. So this is some of Kirstin's, I don't think it's her work, but it's some of Kirstin's material. This is, so the sea snow crab in the southern area where we're seeing less sea ice, so the Bering Sea, we had large harvest seasons in 2011 to 2020. In the 2021 season, only 8%. So why? Oh, because there's a northward shift of the snow crab into areas where there is still ice. So in 2021 season, we had a 92% harvest season in the northern region, north of 58.39. So we're seeing shifts of species throughout the Arctic. Could be a risk, could be an opportunity. It depends on what perspective you're looking at. Marine mammals are going to be affected. And I love talking about polar bears. Polar bears are my favorite marine mammals. So I thought that was a good one to choose. Marine mammals, polar bears, rely on sea ice to eat, to feed, and to breed. That's where they feed and breed, on the sea ice. So you can see here in the pictures on the left of the screen, in 1960s, polar bears were very robust. These were Western Hudson Bay, out of Churchill, Manitoba. These pictures on the right, these were taken in 2008 by myself in Churchill, Manitoba. They are a lot skinnier. And there is a couple of scientists that believe that sometime around the 2030s, polar bears, just specifically in this subpopulation of the Western Hudson Bay polar bears, may not be able to maintain a full-term pregnancy because they can't get access to enough food because the ice is melting. So this is, a major risk moving forward. Interestingly, there's an opportunity that people have, depending on your perspective, that has emerged called last chance tourism. And people are flocking to this area to see polar bears in this area before they are gone. So lots of ethical questions about that I won't go into, but interesting to think about. Something else that's really interesting about the polar bear is that the grizzly bear and the polar bear ranges are now coming together because of climate change. So we now have evidence of what they're calling the Pizzly bear, which is a hybrid polar bear, hybrid grizzly, which we never saw before. So lots of movements in range and habitat of different species because of climate change. Shipping. Definitely a risk, definitely an opportunity. So this is an interesting one, probably my favorite topic. So the idea, of course, is that we're going to go from that picture on the left, meeting icebreakers and having thick multi-year ice, to maybe the picture on the right where it's smooth sailing. And I'm about to tell you that that's not necessarily the case. So I'm going to draw your attention to the top line of pictures. This is sea ice, so thick multi-year ice on the left, breaking up because of the heat, the warmth, the amplification, the albedo effect I was telling you about. It breaks up in the right, and because of the high winds, what happens is those bits of ice, they traverse down from the last ice area. Remember, we talked about the last ice area, into the Northwest Passage, so choking up that shipping lane. So it is not going to be easy to get through the Northwest Passage in the near-term future. The next line of pictures just describes the exact same thing, but with icebergs. So a lot of the icebergs are originating at the Ilulissat Glacier. They're calving off. They're coming down along, Baffin Island, different places. And the icebergs are typically sort of coming further to the east in Canada, but certainly they're also choking up key shipping areas. So risk, there's a lot of risk associated with shipping, and there's a lot of accidents and incidents. So this is some work that we've done where we looked at and comparing accidents in the different polar Arctic regions. We were looking at non-commercial versus commercial vessels. And so I'll draw your attention to the US and Canada because that's who we're talking to mostly today. And in Canada, the red area is the highest number of incidents. So non-commercial vessels are having the most number of accidents in Canada. So it's typically yachts, pleasure craft, smaller non-commercial vessels, fishing vessels, etc. And a little bit in the US, but not as much. Versus commercial vessels where we're still seeing accidents, but not as many. So it is the non-commercial vessels that we're sort of more concerned about in the future. So the Northwest Passage and the Northeast Passage and the transpolar route. So everyone's really interested in this idea of Arctic trade. People have been looking, well, here, let's go here for a second. Like since Franklin, and maybe even earlier, people have been seeking Arctic trade routes simply because it's shorter to engage in trade. Potentially cheaper, depends on if you have an accident. In terms of climate change, these routes are going to become more accessible in the future, but some routes are going to be more accessible than others. And the Northern Sea Route, which is the route, the light blue route along the coast of Russia, is likely to be the first that is more accessible. So we think it'll be accessible by another 100 to 118 days by about 2050. In Canada, we're looking at maybe 14 to 31 days by about 4 degrees warming, which is probably later than 2050. And that transpolar route probably will have an increase, a 50% increase by 2050. But the general message here is that all of these routes are going to become more accessible because of climate change, but also because of technological developments in shipbuilding. So new icebreakers. The Northwest Passage, of course, is the passage that we are interested in from a Canadian and maybe American perspective. There are more than one route, so we call them the passages. And so we've looked at historic navigability, looking at how ice has changed over time, and you have to do this by different vessel types. So there are icebreakers, and then there are slightly ice-strengthened ships, and then non-ice strengthened ships. So I'm not going to go into the details of this, but we'll start here. All you have to look at is the green line, and if the green line is below the black line, then it's not navigable. If it's above the line, then it is open and safe to navigate. So as we move through time from top to bottom, what we see is more of that line, more of the green line is above that line. So indeed, over time, we are seeing increased accessibility of the Northwest Passage, particularly in the summer and in the fall, less so in the spring season. So we're likely to see an expansion of trade and traffic in the Northwest Passage in the summer and into the fall. And this is the same thing, but for a different vessel type. So when we talk about vessel types, we talk about these icebreakers, PC3s, the top there, and then medium strength vessels, which are PC7s, and then 1Bs, which are big yachts. So this is Paul Allen's Octopus. So I guess the late Paul Allen's yacht called the Octopus. And what we're actually finding, I think this is quite interesting, over time, we have way more ships in boats in the Arctic that are not ice strengthened and way fewer ships in the Arctic that are ice strengthened. So a little bit concerning in terms of search and rescue and the potential for incidents over time. And the rest of this slide doesn't really matter. This is just how we calculate risk by ice type. We also can project this into the future. So once we understand this, we can use climate models and understand how this may look in the future. So particularly in the Northwest Passage, we're going to see an increase of 1 to 2 months at 2 degrees. At 4 degrees, we may see an increase of 3 to 4 months. But it's the Beaufort region and then into the US that is going to see the most increase in accessibility. That is where we're seeing the most warming and the fastest reduction in sea ice. Okay, the last thing I wanted to say was this is some pictures of how we do research to understand sea ice change. So we look at satellite images, we fly airplanes over sea ice, we use sonar to understand thickness. We hang these instruments called EM3s over ships to measure things. Now, this is great, and we need to keep doing this. But this is not as valuable unless we do this, which is to talk to people who actually live there and have the lived and learned experience and understand the ice like nobody from the South could ever possibly understand it. So that is the best way to do this kind of research, is to do it together. So as I promised, I said I would give you some concluding comments. So these are them. First is we've known for decades that the world is warming, but recent changes in the climate are more widespread and are intensifying at a rate and scale that we have never seen before. The Arctic in particular is warming at 3 times the rate of the global average, and the Arctic Ocean, which influences the global climate, remember, is warming at an even greater rate. Climate change will create opportunities and risks for Canada and also for the world. Climate change has increased Arctic maritime access and facilitated an increase in maritime shipping, which I always like to say is a bit of an invisible industry because we don't think about it, but it's a $500 billion industry that brings you absolutely 90% of everything, 90% of what you eat, what you buy, the clothes you have, everything. It's a very important industry. And the impacts of climate change can be slowed or even stopped. Our future climate depends on what we do right now, how we live our lives, starting right now and involving everyone. So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to answer some questions.
Jackie, what a spectacular program. I'll leave you a second to come out of screen share and then we can join for a bit of a conversation. Wow, I mean, literally for a living, I get to work with explorer scientists around the globe talking about Arctic programs a lot. We've been doing this heavy duty over Oceans Week over the last few days. And I think that was the most concise summation of so many things that are going on, all the issues and more that I've ever seen in individual programs. So I appreciate that personally, much less in a professional capacity today. YouTube audience, if you guys have questions, please do share in the chat. I'd love to hear from you. Share as many questions as we can over the next 20 minutes or so, both for Jackie and for Amanda. If you want to hear about the museum's work with regards to Arctic knowledge, exploration, and so much more, we absolutely have the option of doing as much of that as we can. But Jackie, if you can see me again, hopefully you're all set up and queued up. Let's dive in with an opening question. So first of all, you talked a lot about past Arctic exploration. I find personally my favorite way of learning about modern Arctic is hearing about how it was done and how it's changed over time. You talked about the Franklin expedition. I can't recommend this book enough. Okay, thank you so much for being so keen. Erebus is like a perfect book. You wouldn't know that such a funny person would be so fantastic in nonfiction, but there you go. You talked about shipping being your favorite part of this. Is it because of the nuance and the so many different angles that are coming into it? Because I think you work on so much that was a really particularly fascinating thing to me.
Yeah, I think it's because nobody thinks about it. It's like I said, it's a huge industry. You don't think about it. Your green peppers come by ship. Your collared shirt comes by ship. 90% of everything we touch comes by ship in this modern day world. And shipping has been with us since time immemorial. It was how Indigenous people engaged in trade, back in the day. It's a very important industry. We don't think about it. And it's also an industry that has the potential to both improve the Arctic if managed well and if the industry is supportive, but it can also really destroy the Arctic if we don't manage it well. Invasive species can come in on ships, for example. Ships can create underwater noise profiles that impact marine mammals, that then can go on to impact food security for local communities. So it's a very complex, interesting topic.
Yeah. So you one thing that you did in your talk that I really liked is you highlighted some of the positives and opportunities of these things, because I think our inclination as scientists and as people speaking to the public is to sound the alarm bell. And you did that as well, but highlighting some of the things that might be of benefit to people, I think is a really important element. So I just wanted to thank you for that, because I think it's an important thing to note. Speaking of marine mammals and marine creatures and how they're impacted by shipping, Artash on YouTube wanted to know if there's research being done on exactly how that increased ship traffic is impacting those creatures that you know of or could speak to.
Yeah, so how are the ships impacting marine mammals? Is that the question?
Yeah. Or
Okay.
how are we researching it? Like, how are we starting to research it? Are we learning more? What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a great group of people doing this, and I could name a dozen. But yeah, there's a lot of work being done, and importantly, again, there's work being done that uses satellite images, and we tag marine mammals so that we understand their spatial distributions. There's a lot of really interesting work with belugas. Where we catch and release, etc. But really importantly, the best research that's being done is where research scientists are working with Inuit, particularly Inuit, but other community members. So communities that are hunting or that know these species really well. And so they're talking to each other, working together to understand, changing weight, changing genomic identifiers, everything. So there's absolutely tons of work going on. We also have hydrophones. So hydrophone is basically a scientific instrument that you put in the water, and then you can listen to the soundscape of the water. So we now have some really interesting baseline noise profiles of just the ocean, of the ocean with marine mammals, of the ocean with ships, and then the ocean with ships and marine mammals. So we can see what maybe the impact is going to be in terms of noise on those marine mammals. So there's absolutely tons of research, not enough, and certainly there's more going on in the U.S. Arctic and in a little bit in Svalbard, but we're just starting to do a lot more in Canada.
Well, a big kudos to our NOAA colleagues then that might be tuning in. And I put this in the YouTube chat as well. We actually did a program as our organization yesterday with Bill Halliday from the Wildlife Conservation Society using hydrophones in the Beaufort Sea. So some really special stuff there if you guys want to check that out. I also loved that you mentioned that the people that are doing it better are having this collaboration with Inuit and Indigenous communities. So another book, it's on my shelf somewhere there, is Dead Reckoning, talking about the history of Arctic exploration, where all the mapping and surveying that succeeded in the early Arctic days of exploration were all the people that came in with the attitude of, we know absolutely nothing, but the people who lived here for 10,000 years and beyond know everything. So let's draw from that expertise, let's partner, as opposed to the people who came in and thought they knew things and ended up like the Franklin expedition.
Exactly, and let me tell you a story about that.
Please.
So one of the potential demises of the Franklin expedition is that Franklin was very militaristic in his approach, very we know best, and you can even see it in the attire, the clothing, and so as we know that story didn't end particularly well, and my understanding is they didn't work with Indigenous people very closely. Now Amundsen, who is credited with finding the Northwest Passage, technically going through for the first time, was known to be very collaborative with communities and Indigenous people and was much more successful. And so, there's tons of stories like that in the Antarctic and in the Arctic in the Arctic mostly like that. But people using these learnings from Indigenous people are, you can really see how successful it is.
It's been a theme that's underscored a lot of what we've talked about in the Nature Ideas series generally, and I'm so glad we have it so emphasized in today's program. So shipping in the Arctic is a big topic on YouTube for our audience that's coming through. So is there a map of ecologically sensitive areas and times for vessel traffic? Would that be, I mean, I suppose that would be a useful tool. Does that exist at present? And our Carlos from Oceanwise wanted to know more about that.
All right. Well, yes, there is a map. So the government of Canada is currently and with partners working to create what we're calling low impact shipping corridors. And within those corridors, they're considering what they call ecologically and ecologically and biologically significant or sensitive areas. And we're also working, some of the work we've done is creating maps, communities are creating maps of culturally significant marine areas. So places where they may hunt or where there might be a clam bed, where we don't want someone to anchor, etc. And so all that knowledge is right now is being gathered by Transport Canada, Canadian Hydrographic Service, and who else? Coast Guard, I guess. In combination with scientists and communities so that we can understand everything that's going on and have the least impact as possible.
That's the goal. And I mean, one thing that I love in this changing world is that we're starting to enter into new ways of doing things that sort of mirror things that have been done in the past. So aquaculture was a big one for me growing up, where when I started out, it was this minuscule thing and has grown into this behemoth. And so we had this opportunity to sort of learn from the mistakes of land farming and doing this new thing, where some people did learn from those mistakes, some people didn't. And I think by and large, the overwhelming thing is that it has been a positive experience drawing from that knowledge. And so as we start to have more shipping in the Arctic corridor, Margaret Peckel wanted to know, are we engaging in more sustainable and safe approaches? Like, are we doing this well, or what's our report card score?
Well, this is a great question. I don't know yet. I mean, I really would say that the companies that have been coming to the Canadian Arctic for a long time are doing this well. I mean, they have no reason not to do it well. It's in their best interest to do it well and to listen and to engage in. And I've had really good experience. You know, we did a lot of work with communities identifying these culturally significant marine areas. And those areas, we've had mining operators ask for those areas and that data so that they can avoid those areas at certain times of year so that they're not impacting communities. So in some ways, it's just a matter of getting the information and communicating it effectively. But where I would say we are not doing it well is small vessels. So especially new entrants, which we're going to see more and more of because of last chance tourism, and everybody wants to come to the Arctic and sail through the Northwest Passage. Those are the vessels that fall under certain regulatory thresholds that I'm more concerned about. And there are lots of stories about communities being concerned, and there being some negative stories about these ships. So we do have quite a bit of work to do. But what I always say is, and Jesse, you alluded to it just now, we have the opportunity to do it right in the Arctic, in the Canadian Arctic, because we can use lessons learned from elsewhere and our own unique lessons and create a truly self-determined and sustainable region in a way that you can't do elsewhere that's more developed. It's not a super developed region, so we can actually do it right, but we have to actually commit to that.
Jackie, your voice, your face, you're so full of optimism for these things, and what is a talk that could be, definitely construed as there's a lot of changes happening, a lot of potentially dark changes, and I absolutely love that about you. So this has been so much fun. A quick follow-up on this. You talk about some of these negative experiences, and we got a great question from Dan before the program about how do the Inuit communities, and this is not a monolithic block, it might well be very, very different depending on the community, feel about this increased tourism?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one. I'm a settler, so I'm not Inuit, so it's hard to say, but I can tell you what they've told me. And you wouldn't be surprised to hear this. It completely depends on the person. I mean, what do you think about tourism in your community? What do you think about, the pipeline? What do you think about the conservatives and the liberals and the Republicans? It is what it is. And everyone has different feelings about it, and some are good and some are bad.
Yep. I think that's a very apropos answer. Amanda, your co-speaker, has a question for you. This is what's fun for me is I get to control who asks questions when. I get to bring speakers back. I get to take things from YouTube. I get to ignore people if I want to. It's just way too much power for me, really. But Amanda, come on back in. I love this question. Hey.
Thank you, Jesse, and thank you, Jackie. That was so fascinating. I had the Antarctic on my mind recently because I was reading about the Shackleton expedition. And so when you were talking, I was thinking, do we know why is the Arctic warming so much faster than the Antarctic? Or is the Antarctic warming faster also, but just not as fast as the Arctic? Is that something that we know is happening? Or anyway, yeah.
This is a great question. It's not, I'll use the caveat, this is not my area of expertise, but from what I understand from reading, we're not entirely sure, but there's probably people who can answer this better than me. I think the albedo effect is stronger in the Arctic for lots of reasons. And I don't know, there's some confusing things going in the Antarctic where we're seeing some increase in ice cover for a certain number of years, and now we're seeing a decrease again. And I wish if I have more time, I can look it up for you because it's definitely in the IPCC report, but it wasn't me who drafted that text and I can't quite remember at the moment. Sorry, Amanda.
That's okay. What we can do too is if you do find that after the fact, I know somewhere in the Nature Museum, we have a list of registered people that have joined in. We can always add that information to the YouTube comment section at the end. So if people want that as a follow-up, please do send that to me. I'll make sure it gets up there and then we'll be good to go for people that are keen to learn more. Excellent. Okay, great questions. Geez, there's so many good questions. Margaret wants to know, which indicator species beyond polar bears are telling us about the impacts of temperature changes in the Arctic? Any other canaries in the coal mine for our northern realms?
Yeah, I mean, I'd almost answer that by saying what species is not, giving us some sort of indication of change. I mean, certainly any sort of fish species, we're definitely seeing poleward expansion of species range. Birds, so seabirds, I think I took the slide out, but there's some real impacts on seabirds, which is not something I personally thought much of before until I started doing the reading for the IPCC. But seabirds are highly impacted. So, I mean, it just works its way up the food chain. So if you start right at the bottom, phytoplankton and algae under the ice and create, there's this whole ecosystem and I mean, everything is affected. But certainly there are certain indicator species that are more obvious. And polar bears, certain fish species, char, for example, would be a big one, and then certain seabirds as well. But I mean, it's an ecosystem-wide sort of situation.
Yeah. You have highlighted polar bears several times throughout the program, and I just want to note as someone who's had the chance to go to Churchill too, for any of our audience who's never had that opportunity, first of all, get Aeroplan miles because it makes it way cheaper to get there. It's one of the most special places in the world. I think a lot of us as Canadians think about, great migrations in East Africa and great animal gatherings in South America. And we have beluga whales and polar bears right in their own backyard. And that's such a special opportunity. I think every Canadian should take that chance if they have the opportunity and means to do so.
And if you want to save on your emissions, you can take the train from Winnipeg.
Train. Ignore me. 2-day train trip. And yes, you can catch up on your books. Speaking of books, as has been a theme of my hosting so far, 2 books I read last year lead me to this next question. One is Under a White Sky, which I know I referenced in the last Nature Ideas series. Elizabeth Colbert, fantastic science journalist, talked about some of the changes and sort of unintended consequences of some of our big impacts in the environment. My favorite nonfiction book on climate ever, by far. And Ministry for the Future, which is a nonfiction book about what those next 20, 30 years look like from a geopolitical lens. And in both of them, they talk about the concept of large-scale Arctic geoengineering, including things like dye in the water to help reflect some of that sunlight back. These things that sound so outlandish and crazy. And so as someone who has their finger on the pulse and has worked with governments and other scientists around the world, what is the appetite for this? Is there research being done in this? Or is it entirely like, we don't want to go there, you have no idea what's happening? I'm really curious.
I mean, this is fantastic. I mean, this is the cutting edge stuff. This is the next conversation that we need to have. So I think this is really interesting. I mean, another example in this vein is putting blankets on glaciers to insulate them or on sea ice. So tons of ideas like this. So here's the thinking. Okay, imagine the temperature. I showed you the temperature graph that's going up and up and up. And our threshold that we're trying to stay at is 1.5 or 2 degrees. So we're on a trajectory right now that we're probably going to surpass 1.5 or 2 degrees.
Yeah.
We're hoping we won't, but because, as I explained, because of the atmospheric lag effect, or the amount of time that greenhouse gases stay in the atmosphere, means that we are locked into long-term warming. So some of the thinking is, and of course nobody knows because it's all future projection, right? So I'm just telling you some of the ideas. I'm not necessarily telling you what I think, just some ideas. So some of the thinking is that we're going to surpass that 1.5 degree threshold, and we're going to have to what we call bend the curve and bring it back down. So that's called an overshoot. We overshoot past that threshold and we bring it back down later. Now, according to a lot of the research that has been done in mitigation and adaptation, there are a lot of people that believe that without technological interventions or engineering, geoengineering, as you say, Jesse, we won't be able to bend that curve. So that is some people's perspective. So we are, we do need to look into that. I'm not saying we should, wrap glaciers in blankets, but there is certainly an argument to be made for the need for technological innovation. But, all technology isn't bad. We need technological innovations in renewables. We need to figure out how to store energy in a better way than we have in the past. So we'll see. We'll see. But certainly we're going to need to rely on some human ingenuity.
This is a small segue, just the way you phrase that answer, just something that I encourage our audience to look up in terms of how people are starting to learn how to handle changing climate. In Pakistan, they have something called ice stupas. This was featured in National Geographic, where they literally drew the water from a glacier, shot it up a giant tube, and it froze in this giant pyramid shape, so they could draw water from that for the whole year if it was otherwise melted and the rivers didn't flow the way they used to. So I love that we're starting. It's unfortunate that we have to come up with some of these solutions because of our impact, but it's really fascinating to see how communities and the scientific enterprise generally are working on this. So, Jackie, joint question from a few of our folks on YouTube and beyond. The Arctic is a region governed by a lot of countries, or where a lot of countries have a stake in terms of shipping, in terms of actual sovereignty. It's a very unusual time in the world right now. I think we're sort of at an ebb of willingness for international collaboration right now. Are there both positive examples in the past of when governments have worked together to really help solve an environmental problem? And are we seeing that in these Arctic challenges right now? What's the situation like in terms of people playing nice in the sandbox?
Yeah, that's a great question, especially right now. I'd give you a different answer if you'd asked me about a few months ago. We have played well in the sandbox historically. So there's the Arctic Council, which is a group, of Arctic nations and non-Arctic nations that come together and cooperate. And many agreements have been made. So agreements on oil and gas exploration, agreements on search and rescue. Lots of agreements have been made, really important strides in that area. However, there's a lot of concern about where things are going to go in the future. There's obviously a changing geopolitical situation and changing power dynamic. And I do think that we need to gaze northward as Canadians and as Americans, because things are changing. We are going to see more traffic in the Arctic. We're going to see more research vessels. We're going to see more exploration. And there is tension that does exist in that region geopolitically. And so a lot of these questions are going to need to be answered in the near-term future.
Yep. We are covering so many complicated, big scale things in this program. It's very exciting. Honestly, for me, I'm personally, professional detachment aside, this is great. I'm going to bring back in Amanda to share another question because it again speaks to more people heading up to the Arctic. Amanda.
Yeah, I was just thinking when you were talking about Churchill, you should go see the polar bears. And while that's true, and I think people should see it, it's such an ethical question worth discussing of this last chance tourism having negative environmental impacts, not only increasing emissions because if everyone's flying and traveling and taking big cruises to the Arctic, for example, but also the Arctic itself is this sensitive environment. The tundra is really sensitive, and species tend to be more sensitive to disturbance. And anyway, so how do you think we can weigh sort of the impact of, if people see it, maybe they'll care more, but they're also having a negative impact on the environment? I don't know if there's an answer.
Yeah, that's another tough one. But no, I agree completely, Amanda. It's a tricky one, and we've done some work to calculate the emissions that one sort of creates when going to Churchill, Manitoba to visit polar bears. It's very ironic, isn't it, that you're going to be releasing greenhouse gases in order to go and visit one of the most iconic and vulnerable species to climate change. So it's a very interesting conundrum. So that you nailed it on the head. I mean, I think the only way we can do this is make sure people are educated. And then what does happen sometimes is people donate money for conservation after they've been there and seen it and experienced it. So I think that's the best way forward is to create ambassadors, and also just to make sure we're doing it correctly. And we need to think about these ethical conundrums. And VR is a great alternative. Not only does it make it more accessible to people who maybe couldn't afford to go, it also saves those greenhouse gas emissions if you're interested in putting on a VR headset and having an experience. So the more experiences we can have set up like that, I think the better. I mean, right now there's a website cam. So in October, November, you can go onto a website and you can watch from your computer, and it's just a camera pointing out on the tundra in Churchill, and you can see the odd polar bears. But I think a VR experience could also be pretty great. I don't know, is someone working on that? Do you know, Amanda? Jesse?
I'll bring back in Amanda. Amanda, is there anyone in the Museum of Nature side? Because I have a few things that I'm going to bring up in a second, but are you guys doing anything like this?
I don't think so, but it's a fabulous idea.
Let's do it, Amanda.
Yeah,
let's do it. Okay, that's our takeaway from the program. I will note on these things, the best organization possibly in the world, and not just for individual polar bears, but just in general in wildlife outreach. Polar Bears International does such an amazing job with education outreach. They are such a special group of people. We've had them on for many broadcasts. They're exceptional. And you talk about these live cams. For people who haven't heard of this and want to spend their days watching things in the Serengeti or polar bears in Churchill or things in the deep sea, explore.org is awesome. And as a person, this is like a competitor to the stuff we do, it's super, super cool. Explore.org rocks. Everyone should check that out. If you don't get the chance to go in person, I really encourage people to see that. So Amanda, thank you for the great question. Guys, we are in our home stretch here, last 5-7 minutes of the broadcast or so. So if you do have more questions, please do share on YouTube. But I have one that I want to ask, and that is, again, you know so much. You've had this opportunity to learn from and work with scientists around the globe. Things are changing faster than I think any of us expected. I know when I was a boy and people were like, oh, climate change, it's bad, but it's coming to 2100. And now it's it was 45 degrees last year where I was. We had 500 people die in BC in a heat wave. We have Australia set on fire every year. So it's dire, it's scary. And we hear this with kids that we talk to too. You seem like a very optimistic person. And I'm curious if that's just for the program. You're how do you keep positive about this? Or do you keep positive about this?
This is it, Jesse. Okay, so here's the thing. It is dire, and you nailed it. The future is now. The future is right now. But if we go around being all doom and gloom, then we're never going to be motivated to move forward. So I can tell you, as a kid growing up, that was in the 80s, that was kind of the thing, the nature of things. And I love that. I loved the nature of things. And David Suzuki was brilliant. And at that time, it was fantastic. And I was right with them, chaining myself to the trees in Temagami. I mean, yes, in that time period. But in this time period, I just don't think that's the way to go. I think we know, it's undisputable. And most people know and understand. So we have to be positive. We have to look forward and look for solutions. Otherwise, we're just going to do nothing. You can get in the freeze if you're scared. And so fear creates stagnation. And so I just think there's no point doing that, especially if you have a voice as a scientist. We can give facts and figures, but it's up to everyone to act. Like that last line in my presentation says, it's everybody, and it's right now. And if we want people to do something, there's no point in yelling at them.
Yep. It's been interesting for me. David Attenborough was my hero growing up, and his philosophy was always, instead of telling people, you lazy slob, go save the whales, it was show people the whales, and the other part follows where people want to take action. That sort of changed over time. I mean, this is a crisis. It is very urgent. But I really find in the work that I do, and I think work that I see reflected in museums like the Canadian Museum of Nature and across Canada, is that approach of saying, hey, look at these dedicated people doing amazing stuff to protect their local species or their ecosystem or what have you. Let's adopt that. And I think that's the nicest thing about the scientific community generally, is you talked about all those collaborative authors on these papers and so much more. And I think the fact that so many people want to work together to do such positive good, and the fact that really in the scheme of history, you know, climate change is an issue that we started seeing 70s, 80s, where we were really like, okay, this is something that's happening. You can see it in Carl Sagan's early stuff. And in 40, 50 years, which by human standards is like that, we have the world mobilized. We have million kid marches around the globe. So Greta and her amazing work to do that. We have governments that are working to promote these renewables. I think that's all really positive. We are going to lose quite a bit, and there's going to be a lot of challenges ahead, and you highlighted a lot of those. But frankly, I think from the international community, it's really positive, and I think that that's an important thing to note. So thank you very much for that sentiment. Again, if anyone else has any other questions, please feel free to share in the chat. We've got a few more minutes together. Before we wrap up though, Jackie, you highlighted so much in your talk. Is there final messages people should take away from your talk, your work, where places where people can go to learn more that we could recommend? Anything to keep the learning going after this broadcast is done?
Yeah, sure. I think the IPCC is really the place to go for scientific information. So that's where you'll find all of the reports, the assessment reports, and the science. So, and if you really want, I think it's something like, oh, I can't remember how many pages it is, like 16,000 or something crazy. So if you really want to read it, go for it. But there are summaries. There are summary for policymakers, and I think you've got the link there, Jesse, at the top of the chat if you want to. Yeah. Oh, great. And
yeah. Any other link we need to share? I've got IPCC's main website there, and I can find more. You have a bunch of things that you've listed, but do keep going.
Perfect. No worries. Yeah, go to the IPCC, check that out. But also just look around locally. What's going on in your local community, and what kind of initiatives can you get involved in? I mean, there's youth climate action groups everywhere, and there's tons of. You know, I also go, if you live in Ottawa, go to the Museum of Nature. And check out the Arctic exhibit there. It's fantastic, and you'll be able to, you know, there's people, you know, they did a great job talking to people from across the region, scientists and Inuit. It's yeah, great.
Outstanding. Amanda, do you recommend going to the Museum of Nature too? I know you actually have to. But
I do.
It really is. As someone who grew up in Toronto with some of the museums here, and I've had the chance to go to a lot of amazing places across Canada, the Arctic exhibit in particular at the Museum of Nature is really special. If you're in Ottawa, take a chance and learn more. Amanda, yeah.
And I'm pretty sure on Thursday nights it's free. If that was a thing we were doing for a while, I'm pretty sure it's still happening. So after 4 or 5 p.m. it's free. So that's great.
And if you're wrong and the flood of people start coming at that time, we'll blame you and we'll blame this talk. It's up on YouTube forever.
Perfect.
So there you go.
Yeah.
One more place is ArcticNet too. ArcticNet and works with the Museum of Nature, and so ArcticNet is Canada's Arctic Science Network, and so the on the website there's access to tons of amazing scientists and people, and including Northern and Indigenous researchers, not just people in the South. So that's another good one to.
Now, I've got this up. I know I've seen different URLs for this in the past, but arcticnet.ulaval.ca.
That's it.
Perfect. So if people want to check that out, I'll put that in our YouTube chat too for everybody, but just an amazing, fantastic resource for everybody. And Meg noted 4 to 7 every Thursday, free admission. There we go. See, we're inspiring people to come in person. We're having them check in our Nature Ideas series. It's very exciting all around. Amanda, Jackie, thank you so much for spending such time with us today, highlighting these amazing stories, the work the museum is doing, the work that the world is doing to help understand and help mitigate some of these big challenges. I appreciate it more than you know. I think our audience had some great questions today. So I just wanted to say a big thank you. And I know our audience isn't here with us to scream and yell and say thank you and wave and clap their hands. But I really appreciate you being a part today. And good luck with all the amazing work. We look very forward to following all this good stuff that you guys are up to. Audience, farewell for now. Hopefully you can join us again for Nature Ideas as we continue the series in the months and years to come, and have a